Welcome back. And the Senate late last night on Wednesday overwhelmingly approved a two-step stopgap funding measure, this continuing resolution, preventing a government shutdown that would have gone into effect this weekend. The vote was 87-11 in the Senate in favor of the continuing resolution, or CR. 60 votes were needed for passage. So joining me now to discuss more is Brandon Arnold, the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. So, Brandon, how should we as conservatives understand what this continuing resolution contains? Is this a good thing overall that Speaker Johnson was able to get through the House and now has passed in the Senate?
Well, it's a necessary thing to pass this bill, and nobody really likes doing continuing resolutions. Nobody likes these spending patches. But the fact of the matter is they're better than a government shutdown. Every time we've had a government shutdown in the past, conservatives have lost out. And that's because the media, of course, is stacked against us. They are ready and waiting with all sorts of news stories about how this government shutdown is impacting everybody from veterans to children to small businesses. You name it. They put pressure on conservatives, and eventually we break. So we shouldn't go down this shutdown strategy. What this continuing resolution does is buy us more time to actually get our appropriations bills done. And that's what I think Speaker Johnson has prioritized. And we need to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I know there's a lot of skepticism already. A lot of people are frustrated about this continuing resolution. But I think he was elected Speaker for a reason, and we needed to give him a chance to lead, to pass these appropriations bills and start to tackle this enormous debt problem the country has.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And you're right that a lot of conservatives are frustrated with kind of these stopgap bills. And a lot of the pushback, I think, from conservatives is, well, okay, we don't really care what the mainstream media says. Is it really so bad to have a government shutdown because these are what are deemed as non-essential personnel and workers, and the government itself and national security continues? So why not do that up front and not even really worry about a government shutdown?
A lot of people that say that are from ruby red districts that have their constituents firmly at their back. A government shutdown won't affect their citizens quite as much. They're very, very conservative districts or states. But the people that are in purple districts, and we need Republicans in purple districts if we want to have a majority, if we want to have a speaker instead of turning over the speakership to the Democrats, those people do feel a lot more heat, especially if they're in areas where they have a lot of government workers, where they're close to Washington or other parts of the country. Those people get walloped when we have a government shutdown. And at the end of the day, a government shutdown doesn't yield really strong benefits for us. It ends up costing us money because it costs money to restart the economy. We end up paying these government workers who sit on their tails and watch TV during these government shutdowns. We end up paying them double, essentially, because not only do we give them back pay, we give them all sorts of disruption pay and so forth. It becomes a huge mess. So I just don't think the shutdown strategy works. It may play well in a few districts, in the more conservative districts, but in those purple districts, in those districts that we need to hold on to or win to gain seats in the House and to win the Senate back, it's a real losing strategy.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of people who want the best case scenario aren't necessarily looking at the practical reality of what can and can't be done. And I think a lot of criticism from the right or even the far right of Speaker Johnson really doesn't take into consideration how narrow the majority of Republicans in Congress actually is, and also how broad the conference is. And for Speaker Johnson to be able to hold the conference together and then actually get to the appropriations bills, it seems like he does have a very good grasp on what needs to be done. And it's not that he's compromising or taking concessions in a McCarthy-style lane, but genuinely understanding where to prioritize the fights. So do you see that in terms of his leadership so far, and where do you expect this to go in terms of appropriations?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think he's a very savvy guy. He's a very intelligent guy. I don't know if you've had him on the program or not, but you certainly should.
Yes.
You'd agree on a lot of issues. He's a very, very intelligent man. And listen, it's about picking which hill you're going to die on, which hill you're going to fight on. And the hill to fight on is certainly not over the continuing resolution. You're just not going to achieve a lot there because you're only talking about a very small window. We're talking about funding parts of the government into January, some into early February. So you're talking about a pretty narrow piece of the overall government spending pie. The big fights are going to be over these appropriations bills, and that's where we need to have Republican unity because, like you said, the majority is extremely small. And that doesn't mean nobody's going to get everything they want. I think that's really what's the dynamic that's changed with the frustration with McCarthy and his ouster. You know, people got this impression that, hey, we can get everything we want. And that's never the case when you're in a legislative body of 435 members. You have to make some concessions. But let's not make the perfect of the enemy of the good. Some of these appropriations bills that they're moving are very good. They make tens of billions of dollars in cuts to existing programs relative to last fiscal year. You know, they rein in the Biden administration, prevent Biden from creating this expanded IRS with the ability to take over the tax filing process. They rein in the Federal Trade Commission, which has been an absolute renegade agency, trim what some of the Department of Labor is trying to do to shut down the franchise model that would essentially handicap McDonald's owners all over the country and other franchisers. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff in there. These bills are never going to be perfect. They're always going to spend more than a lot of folks would like. There's always going to be some problems with them. But overall, we got to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's make some progress in chipping away at this massive federal debt and these enormous federal deficits.
And I'm speaking with Brandon Arnold, who's the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. And the focus on appropriations and making sure to cut deficit spending. And even when you look at where Speaker Johnson and even representatives like Chip Roy have been very vocal in saying if there is a funding aid and a funding package to Israel, then they need to take that out of some other appropriation so that it's not just writing a blank check that we don't have. And all of that, I think, really makes sense to a lot of conservatives that want to focus on maybe some more of the dynamic or politically controversial things like the impeachment of Biden, for instance, or the weaponization of government committee. I mean, all of these things that are very important. Why should we be paying attention to appropriations that maybe aren't as interesting to the average casual Politico, but are very important to the functioning of America and also making sure that we do rein in all of the spending?
Yeah, well, they're interesting to me, Jenna, but I get it.
Well, that's why you're on the program, because you get to tell us why they are.
Well, thank you. I totally get it, though. Appropriations, people's eyes glaze over when they hear about government spending, billions of dollars going here, there, wherever. But like I was saying, the appropriations process isn't just about dollars and cents. Embedded in the appropriations bills are provisions that say the Biden administration cannot pursue this regulatory strategy that it's currently doing. That means you can use this spending process to essentially kneecap, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, the FTC, all of these agencies, you can put in provisions that say this agency can no longer implement this regulation. So those franchise rules, this IRS expansion, the FTC and its anti-capitalist endeavors, all of these agencies can be reined in. We can kneecap these agencies through the spending process. That's why it's really essential. Of course, the top line spending numbers matter a ton. We have a $1.7 trillion deficit last year with no relief in sight. So that's a top priority as well. But there's so much that we can do for this process beyond just cutting dollars and cents.
And so as we move forward into this whole process, and Congress can do multiple things at the same time. I mean, I know mainstream media would not like us to believe that. And if somebody like Jim Jordan is focusing on the weaponization of government committee, then somehow Congress isn't getting literally anything else done, according to them, which I think is ridiculous. But in terms of for the constituents and for Americans who are concerned about this, where should we be paying attention in the next weeks and months and actually engaging in the process ourselves? Because I think for a lot of representatives, and particularly on the Republican side, they may not hear from constituents as much on things like appropriations as much as more of the political, red meat topics. And so where should we be engaging in terms of encouraging our legislators to actually vote conservative and responsible policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff going on. As you said, it's not just the spending process. That's dominated all the headlines because we've once again flirted with a government shutdown. Thankfully, we'll avoid that. But yeah, I mean, the Israel funding package, I think is really important. I think Speaker Johnson deserves a ton of credit there. I can't remember the last time we had an emergency supplemental appropriations bill that was actually paid for with spending cuts. No tax increases, just spending cuts. So he deserves a ton of credit for starting that process in a positive direction rather than just following the old Washington, D.C. strategy of just adding on to the national debt. I think there's momentum, not a ton, but there is some momentum to do a tax package. We have a lot of expiring provisions that were part of the Trump tax cuts of 2017. Some of them have already expired. Some of them are going to expire in 2025. We really need to lay the groundwork there if we want to move away from Bidenomics and back to the tax policies that grew the economy, that kept inflation low, that produced a ton of jobs. And I think that work is being done right now by the Ways and Means Committee in the House, but it's an uphill battle, and every constituent that weighs it, makes it a little bit easier to get that ball across the finish line, to have good tax policy instead of the nonsense that we've seen for the past couple of years out of the Biden administration.
Yeah, and this just underscores, Brandon Arnold, why we need to all be engaged and take responsibility for that engagement in our government, not just be sort of passive recipients of whatever Washington generates, but also be active and to make our voices heard and truly act like constituents instead of just complaining on the backside or going along with the mainstream media's narratives about Speaker Johnson. And so, Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President at the National Taxpayers Union, really appreciate your commentary this morning. And we welcome back. And the Senate late last night on Wednesday overwhelmingly